Hi, welcome to the third and final extra lecture for Problems of Philosophy. This is going to be our only foray into political philosophy. So we're going to look at two pretty different systems of organizing society. And we're going to look at John Rawls and Plato. Okay, so let's look at some background information first about political philosophy. So it looks at questions and the problems that arise when you form governments. How do you organize them so everyone prospers? You have questions about justice, about wealth distribution, about government regulation and individual freedom, about power and who gets to have it and why. And those are some of the core issues that political philosophers study. So in Western society, there have been two competing frameworks in political philosophy as to what is at the bottom, the root principle of what it means to organize a good government. So the first one is individual freedom or individual personal liberty. This is classical liberalism. So think about the root of the word liberalism. It just means liberty, individual freedom. Our Constitution is founded on the idea that we should have as much individual freedom as possible. And the second one is equality amongst the citizens, egalitarianism. So that would be the bedrock of society. And you can see how these would clash, because if you're going to enforce equality, either formally with laws, everybody is equal under the law, or even further, wherein you try and make sure that everybody is free from discrimination and you try to bring everybody up to the same kind of starting line, that's more than formal equality. That's a more pervasive equality, which might involve wealth redistribution. So that's going to curtail individual freedom quite a lot. There are going to have to be a lot of rules and regulations to make sure that people are as equal as possible. And that really, really limits individual freedom. So there's been a push and a pull between freedom and equality throughout Western history. For the past few class sessions, we've been looking at moral theory, namely Kantianism and utilitarianism. So the former, Kant, looked at your internal motivations, which later became the bedrock of the idea of individual human rights. And the other one, utilitarianism, of course, looks at the consequences of behavior. And each one claims that this is the foundation of what it means to be moral. So likewise, in political theory, some argue that individuals should retain as much power over themselves as possible, and that's individual freedom. And others say that the welfare of the majority matters than any individual, and that's the equality angle. So with free choice and little regulation, the distribution of wealth and other social goods, and we've talked about a lot of social goods, healthcare, quality housing, education, access to jobs. So that usually becomes skewed over time. When individuals act however they want, that adds up to massive inequality. But in this case, the positive part of it is that government has very little power to manipulate individual lives. So you have a lot of personal liberty. But the advocates of equality, on the other hand, say that it's part of any government's job to protect its citizens. And that role includes that the government ensures that every person has a roughly equal chance to succeed. So in this case, the government must necessarily interfere with individual freedom, because only regulation can ensure this kind of access to equal opportunity. Because if there's no regulation, remember, we get that skewed system where there's a giant gap between the rich and the poor, and civic life suffers. public transportation and education degrade, access to healthcare, museums, parks, all of these things crumble without government interference. So both of these schools of thought are classically liberal. It's a philosophical position that has roots, like many of the philosophies we've studied this semester in the Enlightenment. So liberalism in this sense means that you're an advocate of liberty for all. You can think of equality as a kind of liberty as well. So there's two kinds of definitions of what it means to be liberal. And the government has to figure out how to implement policy to take into account both freedom and equality. Okay, so some other tenets of classical liberalism is that every individual has human rights, personal freedom, the right to have power or autonomy over your own body, your own life, your own choices. Before thinkers like Locke, Hobbes, Kant, and Rousseau, these are all Enlightenment thinkers, liberty of individual persons to own private property and choose how to live their own lives. That wasn't part of the political discussion. People were expected to accept the power of the state over them, their bodies, and their lives. So classical liberalism was a giant shift, and our government is founded on it. Okay, we still see this major division in our government despite whatever flaws our government has. Republicans generally espouse smaller government and more individual freedom. Those are part of their core ideals. And Democrats advocate for greater equality. Both parties, at least on paper, are at least in part classically liberal. They have deviated quite a bit, each in their own ways. But our Constitution and our most cherished American ideals are all founded on classical liberalism. So I have some authors there that you might have heard of in history or American government class. Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense, Jefferson, who helped create our Constitution, Alexander Hamilton, who was an author of some of the Federalist Papers. These are all advocating individual liberty. So with this background, we can move on to John Rawls and a theory of justice. So Rawls had a book that is of the same name as this short selection, and it's sort of an attempt to merge the theories. He's still a classical liberal, but he wants to take into account both individual freedom and equality. And this book continues and was a massive success, and it has a very strong influence on a lot of political thinkers, philosophers, political scientists, policymakers, politicians, economists. From the introduction, to Rawls on page 631. Rawls contends that the fairest way to distribute goods is in accord with principles that everyone would accept, regardless of the abilities they happen to possess, or the social or economic circumstances in which they find themselves. Okay, so he's looking for principles that everyone would accept, but not just everyone as they are. And we're looking for principles to build the most just government that we can. And how do we do that? He thinks that if you strip away the social or economic circumstances in which you find people, you have a common human core there. And those people, the people who are only using their common human core without regard to their social or economic circumstances, they'd be able to rationally get to principles that should govern how we form our government, and that we can reason to them here. So he gives us a thought experiment to try and do this. We have to learn what the original position is and the veil of ignorance. Okay, so in order to understand Rawls' thought experiment, we have to do what we've done a lot of times this semester. Try and imagine what every single human person has in common. On the other side of that, we need to ask ourselves what it is that makes us different to one another. So we're all rational and we're all self-interested. We have individual, rational, self-interested persons all trying to get together and form a government. And since we're rational, all that means is that we use our capacity for reason to figure out who we are, what the world is like, and what we need to live our best lives. That's what we use our reason for in this sense. We're self-interested insofar as we want to get the things we need and desire in order to live those best lives. And the key thing here is that every single person has this rational self-interestedness as part of them. So those are the things that make us alike. And Rawls talks about how everything else is what makes us different to one another. So this everything else is what creates our individual goals, our individual desires. We have personal traits like intelligence, strength, health, both mental and physical. So who we are, our personalities, our place in society. So you're rich, you're poor, you're from a specific country, what city or region that you're from, and our social identities, our skin color, our gender, our religion, our sexuality. So this is the everything else that makes us different to one another. And all of these characteristics shape what our desires are, what we want out of a government system. So the original position in Rawls's thought experiment is that bare, rationally self-interested group of people that make up any state. So if you wipe away that everything else that makes us different, you're in the original position. We have people that are rationally self-interested, and that's that. They're all sitting together in a room or in separate rooms, and they're going to figure out what principles they should put forth to form a government that's as just as possible. So how would we think about this original position? Well, these people that are in the original position are underneath the veil of ignorance. So you imagine these people, and it doesn't matter how you imagine the setup, but you don't know if you're a man or a woman. You don't know if you're a person of color or if you're white. You don't know if you're from a first world country or a third world country. You don't know if you're physically healthy or ill. You don't know if you're smart. You don't know if you're athletic. You don't know if you're charming or odd. You know nothing about your personal identity. That's somebody who's under the veil of ignorance. So they're all deciding what principles to use to form a government. If you didn't know anything about who you are or who you would be in this society, you would want a system of laws and governance that was as fair as possible, because you could be anybody. You imagine that you came up with the idea of a monarchy. You have a very small chance of becoming king or queen, but you're probably going to be a peasant. So if you're a rationally self-interested person and you don't know who you're going to be, you're not going to come up with a monarchy. You're going to want a system that's fair. And that's what he means when he says justice as fairness. You could be the richest person in the world. You could be Bill Gates. But you could also be an orphan in a country that doesn't protect you. You could be ill. You could be a woman or a man. So you would want as much equality and prosperity, both. You'd want the society you live in to be prosperous, but you'd also want it to be as equal as possible. And that would count for every single member of society. So a group of people in this original position, rationally self-interested, and they don't know anything about their personal traits, only that they're a human being, they would come up with two basic rules for government. And on page 632, they're written. First, equality in the assignment of basic rights and duties. So everybody has the same human rights and obligations. And 2, social and economic inequalities are only just if they result in compensating benefits for everyone, and in particular the least advantaged members of society. So there can be inequalities, but only if they benefit everyone. So the first principle aims at making society as equal as possible, while the second allows for individual freedom, as long as it doesn't interfere with the equality. So this makes rational sense if you don't know what your identity is going to be. That way you have the best chance of getting into a world where whoever you end up being has access to a good life. So when you're individually free as possible, the rationally self-interested will use all of your skills and abilities to accumulate wealth and social power. So you're as absolutely free as possible. This would be more the classical libertarian sort of view. That's how you build a good life. So the theory is, if you're prevented from doing this, using your skills and abilities and position in the world to advance, the theory is that you'll no longer be motivated to use those individual skills and abilities, either for yourself or for the good of the whole. So that's a common criticism of socialist policies, or even any policies that aim for as much equality as possible. Okay, that's going to be the end of part 1. I will see you in part 2.